I'd first like to welcome everyone to the Bonner Institute webinar series. And I'm absolutely delighted we have the very distinguished Lyn McDonell, who is going to provide us a presentation on regenerative governance. And I'd just like to state that I became acquainted with Lyn through a book that Lyn is one of the authors of, and that is the Handbook of Board Governance, second edition. And I'd like to note that Lyn wrote a very important chapter in the book, pages 283 through 300, The Art of Asking Questions as a Director. And that is an absolute essential skill for directors, and it's even more critical given the challenges that boards and the organizations they oversee face. And I'm also excited to say that Lyn will be writing, I believe, 2 chapters in the upcoming edition of the book. And we have the privilege of getting some insights into some of those ideas.
Thank you, John. And thank you, the Bonner Institute, for this opportunity to talk about this. And thank you for the folks here and the folks who I know will be watching and listening to this afterwards for your time and your interest. I'll get to my background in a moment, but what I'm going to be suggesting this evening in our time together is that governance is, kind of in a stuck position and needs to be upgraded with some new thinking that's really appropriate for the complexity of our times. And I come to this conclusion as a result of my background. So my background is, for years I was executive director and coordinator, and then CEO and COO in various organizations. And then I became a governance consultant. Then I became a management consultant, a certified one. And I also years ago spent time overseas in international development and then in international development organizations and learned some of the concepts of appropriate development in that setting. I also, and this is I'm still on the topic of my master's thesis in sociology, which is organizational development and stages of organizational development. And this particular topic is also related to kind of the evolution of organizations and their interaction with the environment. So it's very much on purpose for what I originally was interested in so many years ago to earn my master's. But the synthesis that really I'm pulling together here is from my years as a facilitator. And over the past 2.5 years, I've listened to and been part of just remarkable conversations across different communities. And I think that was, we all learned in COVID, right? We all went on our various journeys. But for me, it was everything from the sense-making liminal web community to the energy shift, to the climate change, to the deep adaptation movement, because there is one, sustainability and the issues of sustainability, of course, the SDGs, to inner development and sort of the presencing and sort of being here now and having the resources, the inner resources to see truth of what's happening and to respond in a resourced way. Web3, understanding DAOs and some of that interesting stuff that's happening. Cognitive science and how we think and how we frame things and how it determines what we see and what we don't see. Regenerative economics and approaches and systems thinking. So I've just finished a Fritjof-Kaproff course, which is on systems thinking, which was fabulous. And at least a couple of you might know about that. So it has been quite a journey. And then because I became so aware of our situation that we're in a predicament, it was like, okay, how do I bring it back? What is my remit, in this environment? Because I'm deeply worried, in fact. And it was realizing that I need to come back to my field of governance, my field of organizational development, and really infuse it with all that I've learned to sort of pull together and synthesize. And that's why I say my facilitator experience is probably the most pertinent, because I've done so much listening to different communities and realized that we are at a critical juncture, and there's been ideas like tonight. I'll share some of the ideas that I've learned, but they're pulled from various communities, and I've just kind of packaged them for governance, because I think governance needs that sort of update. So it's an evolving thing. Like, I don't think I have the answers. I do think the direction of travel that I'm talking about is a good one, for reasons I'll explain. I'm wanting to plant seeds. I'm wanting you to recognize that there's that we all can contribute to this shift. And I will, as a way of going forward, I'm going to just speak a little bit, continuing on this situation. But then I'll show you some slides. We'll have a pause. And then we will, for you to put some reactions in the chat, and then we'll pick it up again, which is more the practical side of implementing this regenerative perspective. And then we'll have a conversation at the end with John, so and with you. So that's the plan of approach. But yeah, so that's my journey. But I want to, before I show you slides, because sometimes I can get so slide focused, I want to just talk about this current situation. Someone said, or they've said something, we're living a life that no longer exists. We're in a world that no longer exists. And we kind of are drifting along, and we're not fully able to respond to it. And it's a very complex situation now. We're in a set of predicaments that governance needs to respond to writ large. So governance is the direction and control towards desired ends. It's how decisions are made, how stakeholders have their say, what the processes and who the decisions makers are, et cetera. And so we kind of have always seen governance as kind of applied to organizations. But of course, we have this macro governance now, because our set of predicaments is so shared, is so huge. And in some of the communities, they talk about it as a hyperobject. Timothy Morton talked about it as a hyperobject, or it's an egregore, which is like this big mass of interlocking, challenging things. So our governance is really today corporate governance, which is where I am particularly focused on. It's got some medieval concepts. It's really was born in previous centuries. And then it really, took accelerated turn to sort of machine level thinking in the industrial age and last century, such that we have in our words, we have in our vocabulary, all kinds of words that really are straight off the assembly line, which affect sort of how we think about organizations, how our brains work, so here's, input, production, operations, output, targets, speed, performance, scale, bandwidth, drive, calibrate, moving the needle, right? So we have very much sort of this mechanical approach to thinking about organizations. And the proposition that I'm making and suggesting, it's not new, it just needs to come into governance, is that we are a living system in a living system in a living system. And governance has to take as its primary obligation the care and caretaking of the natural world and of life and our spirits and so forth, which of course in our mechanical sort of, it feels really strange, right? But I'll talk about how it really is joining up to be a more fully rounded approach to governance, which is much needed now. I believe every profession, every organization, everyone needs to find the ripcord and pull it and sort of get this softer landing. In the study that I've done, and any serious, objective look at sort of the climate science, the financial world, and it's not built on real assets anymore, much else, the social issues, is that we realize that we're headed into a very challenging period. We're just at the front end of great disruption. And there needs to be a concerted approach to how we govern. And governance has splintered off in all kinds of different professions, and corporate and not-for-profit and professional and academic, right? It's this increasing specialization and proliferation of professions, each with their own governance, has meant that there's a loss of a centering focus. working towards a shared end. And one of my favorite thinkers, some of you may know, is Nora Bateson. And she said in one article, there's no crime in pulling the world apart to make sense of it, but there is a crime in not putting it back and at least making some attempt to understand the context, the interrelationality that give complex systems their vitality. And Western management and governance is really built in sort of a complicated time, and it's for complicated situations, not for the complexity that we have today. So we need that centering focus. And Herman Daly, who is a ecological economist, he passed away recently in October last year, and he made the point that the economy is inside the environment. It's not apart. And he did this in 1992. He drew this set of charts that indicate that the brown is the economy, the green is kind of the resources of the world. And in a situation where there's less economy, there's less economic development, it's easy to sort of for the planet to absorb the waste, to give the energy and matter and resources that we need for economy. But in a full world, a world like we have today, it's an economy that outgrows its sustaining environment, is in danger of collapse, and more growth can become uneconomic. Because where does the waste go? The environment cannot absorb or assimilate it, and the biosphere is diminishing, and that's a tough thing, right? That suggests that our real issue, the single largest challenge humanity faces, is the negative externalities of human production and consumption. That's the facts of it. And we're going to require 2 planets because of this overshoot. And we're consuming the planet at a rate that cannot be sustained. Our metabolism is just too fast for what the planet can do. And this overshoot leads to many other issues such as climate change, social unrest, loss of productivity, biodiversity, ocean rise, acidification, resource wars. So it's a tough situation. And my concern is that we kind of act, we feel like everything is as it was and is sort of normal, but we actually need to move in governance generally. And this is what I'm writing for this chapter. I hope is that it will be accepted, is that we need to put a base under governance, which is the care of the planet as being kind of everybody's charge. That is what good governance has to include. So even the most, cursory study of living systems reveals that, there needs to be sort of that circularity. And we've heard of circular economy, and that it's important to put that in place. It's a shared project. And without addressing some, like this just concentrates on the materials economy, and there's slides that you will get later that sort of indicate there's also like social issues we need to deal with as well. But it all is symptomatic of our kind of losing touch with what's important and starting to degrade the planet, ourselves, our social bonds, et cetera. So it's not a very happy situation but as a management consultant, and particularly one that is sworn to a code of professionalism, one of the tenets of that code is that you speak the truth, right? You have an accurate diagnosis of what's happening, and you help the client to as constructively and compassionately as possible to deal with the situation. And I think there's some realities that we're ignoring. So the long-term sustainability then needs rules that match the resource systems and the users. And the wonderful Elinor Ostrom, who is a Nobel Prize first woman to win the economics prize, she said this statement, which really speaks to that we need governance to match the situation, this complex situation. And I will turn in the second section to what that means. But the important part of this first one is that there is a macro kind of governance that we all need to participate in because we're all connected. Everything's connected. There's been a splintering of governance to be understood as almost organizational. that we have to go to the deep code of governance itself. What is good governance, to integrate sort of living systems principles to put in, because we are in such risk of in this situation. And you can read, there's tons of things, of course, you can reference. And it's not like, having gone through the learning that I have and have gone through the grieving that I have, which you do with deep adaptation, looking at sort of that whole field of conversation and interest, is that you come out feeling like we really have to get purposeful about what we're doing. And what is more purposeful for boards than to have to deal with, these important issues? So it's not, my suggestion is that the focus on CEOs is largely misplaced, and we need to call on governance and directors to rise to the occasion. But this is the issue, isn't it? Like, our identities are caught up in this. We have rewards from this system. We all do. It's hard to take your hand out of the jar because it's hard to let go of what we have. There's so much sunk cost. There's so much invested. There's fear. And like, what do we do? But governance has to move coherently in this situation, in the living system context, with a broader duty of care that's owed to the public and to nature and to the trust. And if it's not in governance, then where is it, right? It's not, it's like everybody kind of going like that. It has to be like infused into governance. And there's so much that we can do, and we will wish that we had if we don't. Now, you might be saying, isn't this ESG? Like, isn't this what ESG is? And I spent a lot of time looking at ESG, and I'm very keyed into some communities that are watching the standards being set for accounting and reporting. And it's not my direct field, but I'm watching it carefully because it's so consequential. The critique of ESG is it's not context-based. So it's not really in reference to thresholds or what the carrying capacity of the planet is, or in social terms, what people actually need, or it's just very company centric, and it's outside in, it's called. Like, what is the harm that the environmental risk can do to the value of the company over the long term? It's not about the company doing harm. So it's been kind of, it started out when the UN suggested it in some of the years ago. It's kind of started out with sort of that more higher level, but it's been sort of twisted to sort of be about investment. It's not about restoration or regeneration yet. I hope it will be. It has no underlying regenerative, distributive vision. It's so negative business models can be extended over time because it's really, it's about growing or maintaining enterprise value. It's basically disclosure to investors, and they're not the only stakeholders, right? They're not the only stakeholders with information needs, and ESG really just points towards investors primarily. And it's not yet mature. We're just in the early stages of what we need, because the knowledge, the tools, the inclusion of stakeholders and the processes around that, the accounting systems are just in their infancy. They're blunt, they're naive. And the consensus that will be necessary by the governing professions and the stakeholders will take a long time, and it will probably be a compromise. And ESG, some call it everyone's still greenwashing, can lead to greenwashing. And apparently, by hearsay, I learned that sustainability leads who come in, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, thinking that they're restoring the world, find that they're in compliance assurance, which is good, but also brand perception management. It's not the regenerative agenda that we need. So tough stuff. So this is my pause, so that you can take a breath. Me too. And we want you to use the chat to sort of, we'll read the chat, we'll be aware of it, but we will just keep going after we get some reaction from you. So John, we want people to put a comment in the chat about how you are feeling and responding so far, because I put some tough stuff on the table. And please do, because we'll really value your reactions, no matter what they are. We're not looking for anything except your honest reactions.
Oh, yes, please. I apologize. I made a comment and did not realize I was muted. But we invite everyone to place a question or a comment or observation in the chat feature, and then Lyn will resume and we'll go deeper into the topic and, of course, open this up for discussion.
And you must put something in, otherwise I'll just hold here because I really do want to hear.
Oh, I'm putting something in right now too.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yeah, thank you for yeah. Really appreciate this. Yeah, really good. Thank you. We will be keeping these comments. Let me go on so that we will have that more substantial discussion at the end, and we continue to welcome your comments. So you might say, how does this translate into governance? Like, what does a board do? And let's remember, the word regenerative is interesting. It's interesting. It's important. It means that conditions for life and an ongoing vitality are present. It indicates there's a flourishing, the realizing of some potential that is enfolded in the present. Regenerative efforts can be applied to many things, a field, a body of water, a forest. And here we're looking at applying it to organizations and to communities and to sectors and, of course, to governance. And the organizations are they have aspects of living systems, and they're embedded in living systems, and they're dependent upon living systems, as we all are. And they have living systems properties. They're alive or not. I don't know whether you've gone into organizations where you feel like there's energy in this place, right? That's a live organization. People are loving their work. They're relating well to each other. It feels like a healthy workplace. That's alive. And then there's others where people are checked out and they're just going through the motions. And there's sort of this feeling that, the organization is just a dead zone. And you can see with the Great Resignation and people, individuals, both younger individuals, but also those who are at all ages, are looking for purpose at this point in their lives, and particularly given our wider situation. So they want to be in organizations that are contributing. So the living systems perspective is really the North Star of what we need to do. It's the turning towards flourishing. It's kind of like a tropism, right? It's life affirming. And there's management firms and communities and intentional communities that are really trying to demonstrate this kind of way of being. And it is a way of being, and it's exciting and it's promising, but it's not really infused into governance itself yet. It kind of is taking place, apart from sort of this formal side of the organization, and that's not going to be sufficient. And if you look at this chart, you can see that we are wanting to move from sort of conventional thinking to regenerative. And on the regenerative, there is that holistic thinking and thinking about the patterns, the patterns of nature and how we understand, what the cycle of nature, the renewal and the creative, and then the abundance and plenty that we might experience, but then we become sort of over stiff, and then there's that creative destruction, and then there's renewal again, and there's cycles, right? And we have we have to think about how they take place in our own organization. One of the things that I'm not doing in this session, and I need to acknowledge for some who might watch this later, is I'm not dealing with some of the new experimental type organizations, be it in the Web3 space like DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, and some of the cool things that are happening there, or the intentional communities, or sociocracy, which is a place where regenerative governance is a term that's used, or collaboratives, or the certified B Corps and so forth. I'm really getting at sort of the classic governance folks who are in the established organizations and institutions. So I recognize that there's some really important other models out there, but I'm kind of getting at the establishment view of governance. What I want to do here is just share with you some helpful frames. And these would be ones that I hope to turn into tools this next year, some ways in which I work with organizations so that this is something that they can use in their own setting to see things differently. And the first one is, view from above. And it's not a hierarchical term. It's more that there's a big picture view. The late systems thinker and Limits to Growth co-author Donella Meadows, she said something really beautiful, and I quote, people can't respond to information they don't have. They can't react effectively to information that is inadequate or achieve goals or targets of which they are not aware. Missing information is one of the most common causes of system malfunction. So the board needs to really see the relational network because it's nested in different systems. The very narrow view of just their own organization is not sufficient. They need to sort of see that who they are connected to. And to use quantitative and what's called warm data and wise use of AI, because I think there's some promise there to understand the interdependencies. And I sometimes talk about it as like, who are you in the river with? Like when the disruption happens, who are your partners who are going to help you be successful as an organization, as a sector, as a community of people? And it's this, those are aphids and ants, but it's sort of, doing that mapping, right? And mapping and understanding that relationships and social bonds are going to be really important in the next period, and that governors and boards and directors value that. And the next one is multi-capital stewardship. Multi-capitals is this understanding that wealth isn't just finance. It's natural capital, it's experience capital, it's intellectual capital, it's social capital, it's cultural capital. I don't like the term capital, but the value of it is it sort of goes up against finance as a comparator. So there's different forms of capital, and we can see that they are, and there's 8 here, sometimes there's 6. I think energy should be pulled out given its importance in the future. But that aside, we need to understand that organizations are going to, by 2030, 2035, we are going to be in the world of stocks and flows, and understanding how organizations have a negative footprint or a positive handprint on the true multi-capital status. And that means different indicators, according to what the organization's involved with. And it reminds me of, do you remember in a couple of 15 years ago, risk in boards and governance was the main thing, and everybody had to learn about risk and do risk registers and heat maps and understand sort of, probability of impact, probability and impact, and I think the whole multi-capitals and stocks and flows is where we need to start to move, the thinking. It feels weird now, but I think when you see that earlier, that DALI, the crowding out of the green, you realize that we have to have a more circular approach and a more restorative approach. The next one is, I won't spend any time on these last two. Well, this one, living systems literacy. So we're going to have to, and we can, have this two-eyed seeing. So two-eyed seeing, which is from Nova Scotia, Micmac elder Albert Marshall, says that on the one hand, it's Indigenous, seeing the relationships between things, nature, the space between, seeing nature as kin and everyone as kin, and having that sort of more that more integral view of relationships. And then on the other eye is our usual Western logic, scientific. We need both. And so two-eyed seeing is a competency that we need to learn and apply in the boardroom and ask difficult questions. You know, this is going to require a lot of inner strength. And the ecological and complex systems, we need that too. We need people to understand sort of this complexity, and that decisions that they make today are in a much more nested context than ever before, because everything has to be sort of considered. And the other really useful tool is three horizon thinking. It started out in McKinsey, but Daniel Christian Wall and Bill Sharp and others who the regenerative community would recognize, those latter two names, they have adapted it for this setting. And it's really that boards need to think in three time frames. One is business as usual, and the second is the transition, which is going to be challenging, rough. And then the long term, which is the viable future. And it's not like traditional planning. It's more that in every decision that's made, you have to have the those horizons in mind, because at every decision you're setting up the conditions for the future. You're setting up what resources are available, and what optionality, or that's why diversity is so important. So yeah, so I mean, there's lots here. I'm just skimming it, but it's so important to have sort of this three horizon. You can just take a moment to read this. I think it's too much to go through, but in a moment, I'll just sort of do the headlines, but just take a moment to read if you wouldn't mind. So you can see that this is on the people side, and that the board really, I call it holding the container. There might be a better way of putting it, but the governance role, whoever is the governance, is really creating the conditions, right, for this thriving. And it has to be purpose driven, and it has to be flatter structure, because it is more functional for authority and decision making to be at the edges of organizations on a flatter, and not this kind of really top down, because that's not aliveness, but networks and communities of interest are. And the role of, and I'm just going to wind up here. So the role of the board then is identifying the adaptive challenges, of course, setting the highest purpose, and reviewing business models, because not all business models deserve to be in the H3 future, and fostering conditions for a regenerative culture, and maintaining identity and integrity. There needs to be sort of the container also, living systems have boundaries. They're permeable, but they have boundaries. And like, what is the boundary of concern? There's kind of that holding of what is the identity of the organization. And there's macro governance. I think today, if I was to be a little critical, I would say that governance is really macro management. This is what we need, is really macro governance. We need systems governance. So every organization needs to realize that we're really trying to affect the commons and restore and transform something and contribute to it, as number 6 indicates. So good governance in the future, by this, this proposition, which I welcome your thoughts on and views on, is I think it's grounded. It's grounded in, we have to go right deep and say, a living systems perspective has to be part of good governance. It has to be the understanding of that you're a good citizen in planetary living system terms. And after that, it's not like we'll make a profit and then we'll think about the environment. It has to be first, or it has the social economics, social world, the ecological world, has to be nurtured. So a board is creating conditions for healthy organization, because healthy people are able to respond in the future, and to help transition to a path of regeneration and resilience. So that's it. There's lots there. And I'll share with you at the end of today, I'll share with you the slides, and there's lots of slides, or there's a number of slides I didn't show. So I'm going to stop sharing and turn it back to John.
Well, there is a lot to think about there, and I put some points in the comment in the chat feature, and I invite everyone to continue making comments in the chat feature. I'd like to start with a question, Lyn, and I've posed it to you already in earlier discussions. So I just like to say I actually meet several retired board members and retired members of the C-suite, retired CEOs. And I meet existing board members and existing CEOs who say, I feel guilty for what I did in my career. I contributed to pain and suffering when I worked at a global consulting firm. I'm trying to make up for it in my retirement. You would be quite shocked. I can't obviously reveal who these people are. And some of them have placed their wealth in foundations to make a difference. So that leads me to this question. If I am a member of a board or I'm a CEO and I come to you and say, Lyn, we want to, we share your concern and we want to become an organization that makes a difference. We want to adopt regenerative governance. We see the weakness of ESG. We're in a competitive environment, and can we gain a competitive advantage in our markets by adopting that stance? How do we get started with regenerative governance? What do we do practically? It's just the practical, what's the blueprint for a board? Because actually there are people who care, but they feel stifled and they're worried about lawsuits, breach of fiduciary duty lawsuits by not pursuing profit, and they're very frightened. So what do we tell those people? How do we help them? They're more out there than we realize.
I think they're probably the majority on.
Yeah.
You and I have talked about this before, and that some
Yes.
of that profit shareholder, first is so forth. There's some mythology in that, and I'm reminded of this very good book, which I recommend to anyone. The Shareholder Value Myth, by Lynn Stout, who talks about how putting shareholders first harms investors, corporations, and the public. It's not, but it certainly is there's a word for it. It's a common handle, right? Like we bring that into all the time.
That's a future webinar topic.
Yeah. So
I'd like to invite you. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be good. But set that aside. It can feel like it's hard to be an early adopter, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there are organizations like Whole Foods, and Patagonia, of course, is a good one. Interface, years ago in the Interface Carpet, and years ago in the 90s, started the whole sustainability track when no one else was doing it, and just, the tremendous goodwill. And there's pieces of this that organizations are doing, like this is a full spectrum, but like the Veterans Administration is really transforming themselves with human-centered design in the States. Microsoft, Lego Group, I'm just looking at 7th generation, there's lots of organizations that are starting to try this. And so what is the value of it is that their brand and reputation is enhanced. Like if we're going to look at it from a self-interested point of view, the brand and reputation means that talented people, good people, will want to be part of their organizations, and supporters and investors will, this most investors, apart from the short-term, asset managers, are actually long-term investors. And so organizations who are able, or companies that are able to talk about the long term and be able to demonstrate that and earn trust and be subject to scrutiny and get support as a result of scrutiny because they are doing such good thing. I mean, just think of Patagonia. Well, it's a private company, and it's now something else, but it just, it's just has incredible goodwill, right? And also too, and this is going to happen later, is in the greenhouse gas emission space, there's sort of this scope 1, 2, and 3. And at some point with this circular economy, there's going to be more accountability for sort of your use of materials, I think, or there should be. And so tax incentives and support and so forth will come through that, and the readiness for that. And then there's resilience, because if we're thinking this way, if we're able to start thinking in this 3 horizon view, we're much more resilient for a transition and for the long term. And yeah, so it's a legacy thing. It's a leadership thing. If organizations absolutely need a crowd to be doing it before they do it, we might have to wait. But nature bats last here. So I think we're going to have the reality check of events starting to pull us together. How to start it was really that interdependency, that mapping of what is your system, what's your metabolism as an organization, who are you dependent upon, what's their health status, what's the health status of our employees and so forth within our organization, and a learning about complexity and about the ecology. It's a learning thing. We have had directors sort of feel like they have to learn about governance as this, macro management. We need them to think about the system. So that's a lot of answer there, but it's got some pieces there, John.
Yes, and I'd like to invite, if you have a question or a comment, feel free to unmute at any time, or and just speak up, because we do have a small group, and that's a wonderful thing because it makes dialogue possible. Or you can always put a comment in the chat feature. So I'd like to actually dig a little deeper, because I really talk to people, I'll just say in the Fortune 100, actually even more exclusive, but I don't want to reveal whom I know. They talk privately, but they can't talk publicly inside their organization. And, they've commented, well, if I take any efforts here, I'll be fired, I'll be ridiculed. So here's a question: is one technique to make change is to look in history. Are there comparable periods in the history of corporate governance? We know that corporate governance is somewhere around 420 years old, dating back to the Dutch East India Company, and which created the first real board of directors and fiduciary duties. Is there any period of history where there's an example of an organization that said, we're going to deliberately change, we're going to be different from our peers and make a big difference? Or is there a contemporary example that if I went into a board and said, we're going to start a regenerative governance program, and look at this example, this is a company that's succeeding by doing that, and let's follow that good example. Is there a good example anywhere that we can follow, or is this completely new?
Two things. One is, in all these conversations I've been having, I always ask that question, right? I always say, who's a good example of, and no one can come up with sort of the full, I mean, there was, I talked to the fellow who worked with the founder, John something, I forget his name, of the Whole Foods, and just talked about sort of instilling the culture there. So that was the culture piece, right?
Yes.
And then others, this seventh generation was talking about sort of that community support and sort of enabling the community. Like there's organizations that have parts of it. This regenerative governance term is one that is just new, and I'm just taking regenerative and putting it with governance. So it's not like there's organizations that are following it because it's so new to sort of put those two concepts together. But I always ask, and there's not great examples, but that doesn't mean that the path is not right. It just means that the well-worn path is so encoded. Like there's so much in that, in the tradition and the classic and the conventional way of thinking. It is a highway, right?
Yes, absolutely. Does anyone have a comment or a question that you would like to make? So I'm going to start walking through some of the comments that have been submitted in the chat feature. But if you have a comment or question, unmute and just speak up. Feel free to interrupt me at any time. It's more important to hear from you than from me. I'm just a facilitator.
So I see Nick and then Vince, I think. So
yes,
Nick.
yes.
Yeah, I put the hand up the old-fashioned way, not the Zoom way.
Fantastic.
I loved when somebody pulled the book out of their library and went, oh, there's my camera right there.
The loyalty effect.
This dates back to the 80s, 90s. This is by Reichhold, and he was with Bain and Company, which is one of the major consulting companies. And that was I would say the start of a cultural change, similar to what I'm hearing tonight. And that was, how do we get organizations to recognize things that they're not pursuing today? The bottom line was, and I use this even today, and I quite often open up meetings with clients, is saying, what is the purpose of your enterprise? What is the purpose? And of course, I will get the usual, oh, in pursuit of shareholder value and profits and all of those things. And if I come back to, you know, the Harvard business catalog that I do try to consume as much as possible, from the 80s and 90s, we were going through a very similar change. And the organizations that followed that were the likes of Disney, Southwest, were still able to recognize and monitor them today to say, look, the practice and the strategies that these organizations followed were very different than the usual short-term value chasers of the day. And so we can actually look at a track record. And so when I ask organization leaders today, what is the purpose of your franchise? What is the purpose of your business, whether it be for profit, not profit? And I've yet to receive the right answer.
Nick, you were going.
Thanks, Vince.
Thank you very much, Vince. I have a comment on that, but I want to hear from Nick first.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Lyn. Yeah, I just wanted to share an observation. I come to this not from a governance perspective with a curiosity about regeneration, but from a regenerative space with a curiosity about governance. So part of my work is supporting farmers transitioning to regenerative agriculture here in New Zealand. And one of the things that I've observed, and I'm really curious about, you know, the implications into this space, is in order for farmers to make the shift from traditional, this is the way we've always done it, this is who I am, this is my identity, I'm good at it, this is me, to I have no idea how to do this, I'm scared, I'm vulnerable, I'm actually okay to be a beginner at aged 50, 60, 70, is a personal letting go of ego shift that some people can do and some people can't. And it was interesting to hear, you talk about the almost like the legal and regulatory barriers to making a shift. And I just really wanted to name, there's a real personal, individual ego barrier that sits there as well, because for a lot of people, their entire standing in family, community, and so forth is attached to this old way of doing things. And we have people who, they are at odds with all of their neighbours and all of their family, but they know in their heart that this is a change they have to, because they simply cannot live with themselves continuing to do things the way they've done. The positive side of that is it actually creates a community of people who are incredibly open to sharing and supporting and being vulnerable with each other, which I found breathtaking at times. So really interesting how that would play out in this sort of government space.
Nick, thank you. what I've realized too, and it feeds directly into what you're saying, is that to get there from here, there has to be courage of directors in particular to raise questions from this perspective. And it can feel really scary because it is, there's it's almost like standing in that, you've got this river of the way people think and how things are usually done, and then you're sort of bringing in this other perspective which will potentially be seen as challenging or threatening and so forth. And that's why I think it has to be put into the DNA of what is good governance, so that and that's why having it be sort of a new perspective that has some validity to it, that people can start to feel, well, maybe there's something to this, right? Because there's something that they can reference that would, and give them some tools. Like this coming year, I know that people need some tools around that. But that inner development, earlier I was talking with someone, we were talking about inner development goals, that in order to achieve the SDGs, there's also this complementary inner development goals. And I realized that what we're talking about here is for people to realize what's really important and come from a really centered place so that they can ask tough questions and make sure that there's optionality. Like, do we have to be so, can we not create flexibility in our thinking because of this, H1, H2, H3, which means that you're always thinking about how do you not lock in things so that there's different ways of doing it later. And it sounds theoretical, but it also is, it's just going to be a way of thinking and being in the boardroom. And I think there's going to be more people who can, I'm hoping that there'll be a community of directors and a community of CEOs and executive directors who are interested in this, and they're able to support one another. But yeah, you're referring to something that's very real, because the identity part is huge.
Mm-hmm. So, Vince, I just wanted to note some interesting things I've studied is when I went into the history of corporate statutes that in the United States, really dating from the Dutch East India Company and the British West India Company, and this affected Canada. When a business wanted to open up, it had to go to the legislative authority and get a special act of that legislature, and it had to prove that it was being created for a good public purpose. Of course, who defines what the public purpose is, and is that acceptable? And then, the colonies and former colonies of the U.S. found, well, it's very cumbersome. We can't keep up with the volume. We can't have the legislature of each colony meet so frequently to consider all the business opportunities. Let's pass an incorporation statute. And of course, now we have the convenience that if you can make a minimal showing of what's a good public purpose, you can incorporate, you can open your business. So the question now becomes, can we solve it legislatively by going to each, in the United States, of course, each state legislature, and we have them amend their incorporation statute to say, this is what a public purpose is. Your public purpose has to show regeneration. I'm just asking from a practical perspective. That's what I share the goals of regenerative governance. But the challenge I find is, how do you find that first mover? How do you make it happen? And I always go back, Milton Friedman, who is, I think, not completely well understood. He's very well known for saying the purpose of corporation is to make profit, but he also said, yes, there's social harm, but the government will take care of all that. Corporations don't have to think about it. They're regulated. So we just outsource that to the government, and corporations pursue profit, and it's the will of the people. So can we address it legislatively? Is that a practical approach?
What some of you don't know is that John is a lawyer. Yeah, and so we have good conversations about sort of the legal parts of this. And I reference Mary Wood, who's working on sort of this notion of nature's trust, which is an underlying constitutional framework underneath even the U.S. Constitution, apparently. So, and maybe other jurisdictions. But I saw, was it Vince? Was it you that just had a comment there?
Yes.
You're muted.
Vince is muted, and I think Jason Knoll also has a.
Sorry,
Oh,
I'm
Jason.
muted. I'm waving my hands, but I'm muted. My God, no, you do not legislate this.
Yes, yes. Mm-hmm.
It cannot be legislated.
Yes.
The force of the market, and even more so today, where social responsibility is under a microscope, is in some ways it's a good thing. Some ways it's a bad thing, but that is what is going to drive.
Yes, yes.
You cannot legislate it. My God, no.
Yes. Jason, I think you have a comment. We'd love to hear from you.
Yes, well, I would agree with Vincent that we certainly can't legislate it, but I think my thinking behind it was that, before Citizens United, there might have been some chance that the government, would in fact put in some level of oversight and ensuring that corporations did the right thing and those kinds of things. But today, we know how, at least in the United States, how people get elected. It is, through the corporate money. And so, of course, we can't ever really look to the legislative process to put these things in place. And it's interesting because in the book, From What Is to What If, Rob Hoskins, I think his name is, speaks about, if we waited on legislatures, we'd never get it done. Individual people have too little influence. And I have more thoughts about that, and I think it comes back to, what Nick and Lyn have mentioned, the word community. There's really a community that needs to be built, and that's how we can make big change. And so this sense of community between, people who are on boards and CEOs and people who want to do the right thing, who want to make a change, how do they get supported in a sense of community? And the community, of course, involves, the people that they serve as an organization or a company, their customers, and how do companies educate those customers that when they buy this product or whatever, that they are doing something to regenerate. I work with an organization, the Savory Institute, around regenerating healthy soil through grassland regeneration. And there are companies who are putting products out that say, when you buy this product, you are helping regenerate healthy soil. Mm-hmm. And now consumers, start to say, oh yes, and so they'll support those corporations by buying products. So now the long-term profit, can maybe be, the story can be crafted that long-term we're going to be far more successful doing this than our old ways. So those are my thoughts. Drifting a little bit from the legislative, but.
Oh, no, I think you made a very important point, right on point. I just want to note we have reached the end of our hour.